Behind the golden gates of Astoria Palace, where centuries of tradition clash with modern ambition, two brothers stand on opposite sides of an ancient throne. What happens when loyalty fractures, when blood turns against blood, and when the very foundations of a kingdom tremble under the weight of family secrets? In the shadows of marble corridors and beneath glittering chandeliers, a drama unfolds that will either forge a dynasty or destroy it forever. This is not just a story of crowns and ceremonies, this is the raw, unfiltered truth of what happens when power corrupts the bonds that should be unbreakable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Astoria Palace as Prince Alexander Montclair stood before the towering windows of the East Wing, watching the royal guards conduct their daily patrol. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man of 35, bearing the weight of future kingship in his steel blue eyes. The pristine uniform of the royal guard hung perfectly on his broad shoulders, every medal and insignia speaking to years of dedicated service to the crown. But today felt different. Today carried an undercurrent of tension that had been building for months, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Alexander's younger brother, Prince Marcus, had been increasingly vocal about his disagreements with the traditional ways of the monarchy. What had started as philosophical debates over dinner had evolved into public statements that bordered on rebellion against everything their family represented. The heavy oak doors to the chamber creaked open, and Commander Harrison Blackwood entered with measured steps. His weathered face bore the marks of 40 years of service to the crown, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him the most trusted advisor in the palace. The silver threads in his black hair caught the morning light as he approached the prince. "Your Highness," Commander Blackwood began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official business. "We've received concerning intelligence regarding Prince Marcus's activities. Our sources indicate he's been meeting with Republican activists and journalists who oppose the monarchy." Alexander turned from the window, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The news wasn't entirely surprising, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through him. "What kind of meetings, Commander?" "Secret gatherings in various locations throughout the capital. Coffee shops, private residences, even abandoned warehouses. Our surveillance teams have documented at least 7 such meetings in the past month alone." Blackwood paused, his expression growing more serious. "There's more, Your Highness. We have reason to believe Prince Marcus is planning something significant for the upcoming Royal Foundation Gala." The Royal Foundation Gala was the monarchy's most prestigious annual event, attended by heads of state, business leaders, and media representatives from around the world. It was an occasion where the royal family showcased their unity and commitment to public service. The thought of Marcus using such a platform for his anti-monarchist agenda sent a wave of anxiety through Alexander. "What evidence do we have?" Alexander asked, moving to his mahogany desk where classified reports lay in neat stacks. Commander Blackwood approached and placed a leather portfolio on the desk. "Photographs, audio recordings, and witness statements from our intelligence network. Prince Marcus has been particularly vocal about what he calls the outdated nature of hereditary power and the need for democratic reform within the kingdom." Alexander opened the portfolio and found himself staring at surveillance photographs of his brother. In one image, Marcus sat across from a woman Alexander recognized as Sarah Chen, a prominent journalist known for her critical coverage of the monarchy. In another, he was walking with David Thornfield, a political activist who had organized several anti-royal protests in recent years. The sight of his brother consorting with their family's most vocal critics felt like a personal betrayal. "There's something else," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Our technical surveillance unit intercepted several encrypted communications from Prince Marcus's personal devices. While we haven't been able to decode all of them, the fragments we've deciphered suggest he's planning some form of dramatic revelation or announcement." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Alexander closed the portfolio and walked to the ornate fireplace that dominated one wall of the room. Above the mantel hung a portrait of his grandfather, King Reginald IV, whose reign had been marked by stability and respect for tradition. The weight of continuing that legacy pressed down on Alexander's shoulders like a physical force. "Has father been informed of these developments?" Alexander asked, referring to King Charles Montclair, who had ruled Astoria for the past 28 years with unwavering dedication to duty and protocol. His Majesty is currently reviewing the same intelligence reports. He's requested a private audience with you this afternoon to discuss the situation. Blackwood's expression conveyed the gravity of the royal summons. King Charles was not a man given to panic or hasty decisions, but, when he called for private meetings, it meant the matter was of utmost importance. Alexander nodded, his mind racing through potential scenarios and their consequences. Marcus had always been the more rebellious of the two brothers, questioning authority and challenging conventions even as children. But their disagreements had never threatened the stability of the crown itself. This felt like uncharted territory, a crisis that could potentially tear their family apart and damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. "I want increased security around Prince Marcus," Alexander instructed. "Discreet but comprehensive. I need to know every person he meets, every place he goes, every conversation he has. If he's planning something that could harm the crown, we need to be prepared." "Already in motion, Your Highness. I've assigned our most experienced surveillance team to monitor his activities around the clock." Blackwood straightened his posture, every inch the professional soldier. "However, I must advise caution. Prince Marcus is intelligent and observant. If he becomes aware of our surveillance, it could escalate the situation unpredictably." The warning resonated with Alexander. Marcus possessed a sharp mind and an intuitive understanding of political strategy. If he realized the extent of the surveillance operation, he might accelerate whatever plans he was developing, forcing a confrontation before they were prepared to handle it effectively. "There's one more thing," Blackwood added, reaching into his jacket pocket. This arrived for Prince Marcus this morning through unofficial channels. He handed Alexander a plain envelope with no return address, just Marcus's name written in elegant script. Alexander examined the envelope carefully. The paper was expensive, the kind used for formal invitations or important correspondence. The handwriting was feminine, suggesting it came from a woman, but there were no other identifying characteristics. "Our mail screening protocols don't typically cover unofficial deliveries," Blackwood explained. This was handed directly to one of the junior staff members by a courier who disappeared immediately afterward. "We haven't opened it, as it's addressed specifically to Prince Marcus, but, given the current security concerns, keep it for now," Alexander decided. "If Marcus asks about missing mail, we'll say there was a security screening delay. I want our document analysis team to examine it first: paper, ink, fingerprints, anything that might tell us who sent it and why." The decision felt like another step away from the brotherly relationship he and Marcus had once shared. There had been a time when they could discuss anything openly, when their disagreements were settled through honest conversation rather than surveillance and suspicion. But those days seemed increasingly distant as political ideologies drove a wedge between them. Alexander walked to his private balcony, which offered a panoramic view of the capital city spreading out below the palace grounds. Thousands of citizens went about their daily lives, many of them loyal supporters of the monarchy who looked to the royal family for leadership and stability. The thought of disappointing them, of allowing internal family conflicts to undermine the institution they respected, was almost unbearable. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention back to the room. Lady Victoria Sterling, the palace's chief protocol officer, entered with her characteristic efficiency. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her navy blue suit conveyed the professional competence that had made her indispensable to the royal administration. "Your Highness," she began, consulting the leather-bound schedule book she carried everywhere. "I've received several inquiries from international media outlets requesting interviews with Prince Marcus about his recent public statements. How would you like me to respond?" The media attention was exactly what Alexander had feared. Once journalists sensed internal discord within the royal family, they would pursue the story relentlessly, turning private disagreements into public scandals. The monarchy's strength had always depended on projecting unity and stability, qualities that would be severely undermined by visible family conflicts. "Decline all interview requests for now," Alexander instructed. "Cite Prince Marcus's busy schedule with royal duties. I don't want to give the impression that we're trying to silence him, but we also can't allow him to use media platforms to attack the monarchy unchallenged." Lady Sterling nodded and made notes in her book. There's also the matter of seating arrangements for the Foundation Gala. Given the current situation, should we reconsider placing Prince Marcus at the head table? The question highlighted one of the many practical challenges they faced. Reducing Marcus's visibility at major events might prevent him from using those platforms for his agenda, but it would also signal to observers that something was wrong within the royal family. Every decision carried political implications that extended far beyond the immediate family dynamic. Keep the original seating arrangement for now, Alexander decided after a moment's consideration. Any changes would generate speculation and questions we're not prepared to answer publicly. But I want additional security personnel positioned nearby, and make sure our media team is prepared to manage any unexpected developments. As Lady Stirling departed to implement his instructions, Alexander found himself alone with his thoughts. The afternoon meeting with his father loomed ahead, and he knew it would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. King Charles had devoted his entire reign to maintaining the dignity and stability of the crown, and the prospect of his younger son potentially undermining those efforts would be devastating. The private study where they would meet had been the site of many important discussions over the years. It was there that Alexander had first learned about the responsibilities of leadership, where he had been prepared for his future role as king. The room held memories of guidance, wisdom, and the gradual transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. Now it would witness a crisis that threatened everything they had worked to preserve. Alexander spent the remaining hours before the meeting reviewing intelligence reports, consulting with security advisors, and trying to develop a strategy that might resolve the situation without irreparable damage to family relationships or the monarchy's reputation. But every option seemed fraught with risks and potential complications. The clock on the mantel chimed 3 o'clock, signaling that it was time for his audience with the king. Alexander straightened his uniform, checked his appearance in the mirror, and prepared himself for a conversation that might determine the future of the crown he would someday inherit. The weight of responsibility had never felt heavier as he made his way through the palace corridors toward his father's private study, carrying with him the burden of secrets and the hope that somehow they might find a path through the crisis that lay ahead. The heavy silence of King Charles Montclair's private study was broken only by the steady tick of an antique grandfather clock that had marked time in the palace for over 2 centuries. The room itself seemed to embody the weight of royal history, with its dark mahogany paneling, leather-bound volumes of state papers, and portraits of previous monarchs whose eyes seemed to watch over every conversation that took place within these walls. King Charles sat behind his massive desk, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the stress lines that had deepened around his eyes in recent weeks. At 63, he still carried himself with the regal bearing that had defined his reign, but today there was something different in his posture, a weariness that spoke to the burden of the crisis they faced. Alexander entered the study with measured steps, offering the formal bow that protocol demanded even in private family meetings. The king gestured for him to take the chair position directly across from the desk, creating an intimate space for conversation while maintaining the formal structure that governed all royal interactions. Alexander, the king began, his voice carrying the distinctive tone that had addressed nations during times of crisis and celebration alike. I trust Commander Blackwood has briefed you thoroughly on the situation regarding your brother? Yes, father. I've reviewed all the intelligence reports and surveillance summaries. Alexander chose his words carefully, understanding that this conversation would likely be documented in the official records that future historians would examine when studying this period of the monarchy. King Charles opened a leather portfolio containing additional documents that Alexander hadn't seen before. There are developments that go beyond what you've been shown. Our intelligence services have uncovered evidence of coordination between Marcus and several international organizations that actively oppose monarchical systems of government. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. International involvement elevated the situation from a family disagreement to a potential threat to national security. He leaned forward, studying the documents the king placed before him. These communications were intercepted over the past week, King Charles continued, pointing to printed transcripts of encrypted messages. Your brother has been in contact with Republican movements in 3 different countries, sharing what they call strategic insights about weakening monarchical institutions from within. Alexander read through the transcripts, his disbelief growing with each page. One message discussed the psychological impact of internal dissent on public perception of royal unity. Another outlined potential pressure points within traditional royal protocols that could be exploited to create embarrassment or confusion during public events. This goes far beyond philosophical disagreement, Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. This is active collaboration with foreign organizations dedicated to undermining our system of government. Indeed. The king's expression remained composed, but Alexander could see the pain in his father's eyes. The question before us now is how to respond in a way that protects both the crown and the family. These are uncharted waters, Alexander. In all our history, we've never faced a situation where a direct heir to the throne actively worked against the monarchy itself. The complexity of their position was staggering. They couldn't simply treat Marcus like any other security threat without acknowledging that doing so would expose the royal family to unprecedented public scrutiny and potential scandal. Yet they also couldn't ignore evidence that suggested he posed a genuine threat to the stability of the crown. What does our legal counsel advise? Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated. They're researching precedents, but there are very few relevant cases in our legal history. Treason laws exist, but applying them to a member of the royal family would create a constitutional crisis that could ultimately prove more damaging than the original threat. King Charles closed the portfolio and leaned back in his chair. We must find a solution that addresses the security concerns while preserving the integrity of the institution. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Lady Margaret Whitmore, the king's private secretary for the past 15 years, entered with her characteristic discretion. Her gray hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, and her conservative dress reflected the understated professionalism that made her one of the most trusted figures in the palace hierarchy. "Your Majesty," she said with a slight curtsy, "I apologize for the interruption, but Prince Marcus has requested an immediate audience with you. He seems quite agitated and insists the matter cannot wait." Alexander and his father exchanged glances, both recognizing that Marcus's unexpected request might be connected to their ongoing surveillance operations. If he had discovered the extent of their intelligence gathering, it could precipitate the very confrontation they were trying to avoid. Did he indicate the nature of his concerns? King Charles asked. "No, Your Majesty. He simply stated that he had information of critical importance that required your immediate attention." Lady Whitmore's expression conveyed her own unease with the unusual request. The king considered the situation for several moments before responding. "Inform Prince Marcus that I will see him in 30 minutes. That will give us time to complete our current discussion and prepare for whatever he might present." As Lady Whitmore departed, Alexander felt a surge of anxiety about the approaching confrontation. Marcus was intelligent and perceptive. If he had somehow uncovered their surveillance operation or intercepted their communications, he might be coming armed with evidence that could turn the tables on their investigation. "We need to consider the possibility that he knows about our intelligence gathering," Alexander said. "If he does, this meeting could become an accusation rather than the explanation we're hoping for." "Then, we must be prepared for either scenario," King Charles replied. "I want you present during the meeting. Whatever Marcus intends to reveal, we should face it together as representatives of the crown." The remaining 25 minutes passed slowly as they reviewed their strategies and prepared for various contingencies. Alexander found himself thinking about his childhood with Marcus, remembering times when they had been genuine allies and friends rather than adversaries in a political struggle. The transformation felt surreal, like watching a trusted friend become a stranger. When the appointed time arrived, Lady Whitmore returned to escort Prince Marcus to the study. Alexander heard his brother's footsteps in the corridor outside, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that might irreversibly alter their family dynamic and the future of the monarchy. Marcus entered the room with visible tension in his posture, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled as if he had been running his hands through his dark hair. At 32, he possessed the same aristocratic features as Alexander, but, where Alexander's expression typically conveyed calm authority, Marcus's face showed the passionate intensity that had always characterized his approach to life. "Father," Marcus began without the usual formal greetings, "we need to discuss the surveillance operation you've authorized against me." The direct accusation hung in the air between them, confirming Alexander's worst fears about the direction this conversation would take. Marcus clearly knew about their intelligence gathering, which meant he had either discovered it through his own counter-surveillance efforts or been warned by someone within their security apparatus. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," King Charles replied, maintaining his composed demeanor despite the explosive nature of the accusation. "Please don't insult my intelligence," Marcus responded, his voice rising slightly. "I've been followed for weeks. My communications have been monitored. My personal mail has been intercepted. Did you really think I wouldn't notice professional surveillance teams trailing me throughout the capital?" Alexander felt a sinking sensation as he realized their discreet operation had been anything but invisible to their target. Marcus's awareness of the surveillance meant they had lost the element of surprise that might have allowed them to gather additional intelligence about his activities and intentions. "If you're aware of security measures," Alexander interjected, "then you must also be aware that your recent activities have raised legitimate concerns about your commitment to the crown." Marcus turned to face his brother directly, his eyes flashing with anger. "My commitment to the crown? Or my commitment to maintaining a system of government that concentrates absolute power in the hands of people who inherit their positions rather than earning them through merit or democratic selection?" The philosophical divide between them had never been stated so starkly. Marcus wasn't simply questioning royal protocols or traditions, he was challenging the fundamental legitimacy of monarchical government itself. The implications of such a position, coming from someone in direct line of succession to the throne, were staggering. "You swore an oath of loyalty to the crown," King Charles said, his voice maintaining its measured tone despite the gravity of the situation. "That oath binds you to support the institution regardless of your personal philosophical objections." "An oath I swore as a child, before I understood the full implications of what I was committing to," Marcus replied. "I've spent years studying political philosophy, constitutional law, and democratic theory. I can no longer in good conscience support a system that I believe to be fundamentally unjust and outdated." The admission was even more damaging than Alexander had anticipated. Marcus wasn't simply expressing doubts or seeking reforms within the existing system, he was repudiating the entire foundation of royal authority. The legal and constitutional implications of such a position would require careful analysis, but the immediate political consequences were clear and potentially devastating. "What exactly are you proposing?" Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would be equally troubling. Marcus reached into his jacket and produced a manila folder containing what appeared to be prepared documents. "I'm proposing that we begin a managed transition toward constitutional democracy, with the royal family maintaining ceremonial roles while real political power is transferred to elected representatives." The proposal amounted to voluntary abdication of royal authority, a suggestion so radical that Alexander struggled to process its full implications. Marcus was essentially asking them to participate in the dismantling of their own system of government, to cooperate in their own political obsolescence. King Charles examined the documents Marcus placed before him, his expression becoming increasingly grave as he reviewed their contents. "These are detailed plans for constitutional reform," he observed. "You've clearly put considerable thought into this proposal." "I have," Marcus confirmed. "And I believe it represents the only path forward that allows our family to maintain dignity while acknowledging the democratic aspirations of our citizens. The alternative is to continue defending an increasingly indefensible system until public pressure forces more dramatic changes." The room fell silent as the three men contemplated the magnitude of what Marcus was suggesting. Alexander found himself torn between fury at his brother's betrayal of family loyalty and grudging respect for the intellectual rigor of his position. The proposal wasn't the product of impulsive rebellion, it was a carefully considered alternative vision for their country's future. "You understand," King Charles said finally, "that what you're proposing would essentially end the monarchy as it has existed for nearly 1,000 years?" "Yes," Marcus replied without hesitation. "But I believe that ending it voluntarily, on our own terms, is preferable to having it ended involuntarily by forces beyond our control." The conversation continued for another hour, with each brother presenting arguments for their respective positions while their father listened and occasionally interjected questions or observations. By the end, it was clear that the philosophical divide between them was unbridgeable through discussion alone. They would need to find another way forward, one that might preserve both family unity and institutional stability, if such a solution even existed. The aftermath of the confrontation in King Charles's study reverberated through the palace corridors like shock waves from an earthquake. Alexander found himself in the unprecedented position of having to coordinate a response to a threat that came not from external enemies or political opposition, but from within the royal family itself. The weight of this responsibility pressed down on him as he convened an emergency meeting with the palace's most senior advisors. The Situation Room in the palace's secure wing had been designed for handling national emergencies, foreign policy crises, and security threats. Its polished conference table was surrounded by chairs that had hosted discussions about wars, economic disasters, and diplomatic negotiations. Today, it would witness deliberations about something equally momentous: how to manage a crisis that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy from within. Commander Blackwood entered first, carrying updated intelligence reports and wearing the grim expression that had become his default demeanor since the surveillance operation began. Lady Sterling followed, her protocol manual supplemented by hastily prepared briefing papers about constitutional precedents for royal family conflicts. Sir Robert Crawford, the palace's chief legal counsel, arrived with several law clerks carrying volumes of constitutional law and historical precedents that might provide guidance for their unprecedented situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began once everyone was seated, "we face a crisis unlike any in our monarchy's history. Prince Marcus has not only acknowledged his opposition to royal authority but has presented detailed plans for constitutional reform that would essentially dismantle the crown's political power." The gravity of the statements settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These were individuals who had dedicated their careers to serving the monarchy, and the prospect of a direct heir actively working to undermine the institution they protected was almost incomprehensible. Sir Robert, a distinguished man in his late 50s whose legal expertise had guided the crown through numerous constitutional challenges, spoke first. "Your Highness, I've conducted a preliminary review of the constitutional implications. Prince Marcus's position creates what legal scholars would call a constitutional paradox. He remains in the line of succession while actively advocating for the elimination of the system that would make him king. What legal remedies do we have?" Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated. "The options are limited and problematic," Sir Robert replied, consulting his notes. "We could pursue charges of treason, but applying treason laws to a member of the royal family would require parliamentary approval and would inevitably become a public spectacle. Alternatively, we could seek to have him removed from the line of succession, but that would require either his voluntary renunciation or an act of parliament that would expose the entire crisis to public scrutiny." Lady Sterling raised a practical concern. "Any legal proceedings would guarantee media coverage that could be far more damaging to the crown's reputation than Prince Marcus's current activities. We risk turning him into a sympathetic figure, a prince silenced by an authoritarian monarchy for expressing democratic ideals." The observation highlighted the delicate political balance they needed to maintain. Heavy-handed responses could backfire spectacularly, transforming Marcus from a potential threat into a martyred champion of democratic reform. Yet allowing his activities to continue unchecked carried its own serious risks. Commander Blackwood presented the latest intelligence updates. "Our surveillance teams report that Prince Marcus has accelerated his outreach activities since yesterday's meeting with His Majesty. He's scheduled 3 additional meetings with journalists and political activists, including a session with the editorial board of the Constitutional Review, the country's most prominent political reform publication." "When is this editorial board meeting scheduled?" Alexander asked, recognizing that such a venue could provide Marcus with a platform to publicize his reform proposals to a national audience. "Tomorrow afternoon, Your Highness. Our sources indicate he plans to present his constitutional reform plan as an exclusive story." Blackwood's expression conveyed the urgency of the situation. "Once those proposals become public, our options for managing this crisis privately will disappear." The timeline meant they had less than 24 hours to develop and implement a strategy that could prevent the crisis from exploding into public view. Alexander felt the pressure of that deadline like a physical weight, understanding that decisions made in the next few hours could determine the monarchy's future for generations. "I want all available options analyzed immediately," Alexander instructed. Legal remedies, political solutions, security measures, public relations strategies, everything. We reconvene in 4 hours with preliminary recommendations. As the advisors dispersed to begin their urgent research, Alexander remained in the Situation Room, studying intelligence reports and trying to understand how the situation had deteriorated so rapidly. The surveillance photographs showed Marcus looking confident and determined, not like someone torn by doubt or family loyalty. The transcripts of intercepted communications revealed a level of strategic thinking that suggested this wasn't an impulsive rebellion but a carefully planned campaign. Lady Victoria Sterling returned within the first hour carrying updated media monitoring reports. Your Highness, we're already seeing increased press speculation about tensions within the royal family. 3 major newspapers have published articles questioning why Prince Marcus hasn't appeared at recent royal functions, and social media platforms are filled with theories about internal conflicts. The media attention was exactly what Alexander had feared. Once journalists detected the scent of royal discord, they would pursue the story relentlessly until the truth emerged. Their window for managing the crisis privately was closing rapidly, perhaps faster than they had anticipated. What's our current media strategy? Alexander asked. We're maintaining the standard line about Prince Marcus focusing on his charitable work and private study of constitutional history. But that explanation is becoming harder to sustain as more people notice his absence from official functions. Lady Sterling consulted her tablet, scrolling through dozens of news alerts and social media posts. There's also speculation about health issues, relationship problems, and political disagreements. Some of the theories are actually quite close to the truth. Meanwhile, Sir Robert and his legal team had begun researching historical precedents for royal family members who had challenged the monarchy from within. Their preliminary findings painted a disturbing picture of how such situations had unfolded in other countries and time periods. The closest historical parallel might be King Edward VIII's abdication crisis in 1936, Sir Robert reported when the group reconvened. But that involved personal choices about marriage rather than fundamental opposition to royal authority itself. Prince Marcus's position is more comparable to revolutionary movements that have emerged within ruling dynasties in other countries. What were the outcomes in those cases? Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer might not be encouraging. Most resulted in either the exile of the dissenting family members or the eventual collapse of the monarchical system itself, Sir Robert replied gravely. In modern democracies, royal families who face internal opposition have generally survived by finding ways to accommodate reformist pressures without completely abandoning their constitutional roles. The research suggested that their situation, while unprecedented in their own country's history, fit patterns that had emerged in other monarchies facing similar pressures. The key question was whether they could find a solution that preserved essential royal functions while addressing Marcus's legitimate concerns about democratic governance. Commander Blackwood presented additional security considerations. We need to consider the possibility that Prince Marcus's reform proposals might generate significant public support, particularly among younger citizens who are already skeptical of traditional authority structures. If his ideas gain popular traction, we could face pressure for constitutional changes regardless of our family's internal decisions. The prospect of Marcus's proposals resonating with broader public sentiment added another layer of complexity to their crisis. If significant portions of the population embraced his vision of democratic reform, opposing him might put the royal family at odds with their own citizens, a position that could prove politically unsustainable. As evening approached, Alexander found himself alone in the Situation Room, surrounded by reports, legal analyses, and strategic recommendations that offered no easy solutions. Every option carried significant risks, and the approaching deadline for Marcus's meeting with the editorial board created pressure for immediate action. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention to the doorway, where King Charles appeared looking every bit as tired and troubled as Alexander felt. The day's events had clearly taken their toll on the king, whose usual composed demeanor showed cracks of strain and uncertainty. Any progress toward a solution? The king asked, taking the chair beside his son rather than at the head of the conference table. We have options, but none of them are good, Alexander replied honestly. Every course of action we've identified carries the potential for serious unintended consequences. King Charles nodded slowly, his expression reflecting the weight of decisions that could reshape their family and their country's future. Perhaps it's time to consider whether Marcus might be right about the need for change, even if his methods are problematic. The suggestion surprised Alexander, who had expected his father to focus entirely on preserving traditional royal authority. The possibility that the king might be open to constitutional reform added yet another dimension to their already complex situation. "You're considering his reform proposal seriously?" Alexander asked. "I'm considering the possibility that refusing to evolve might ultimately destroy what we're trying to preserve," King Charles replied thoughtfully. Marcus may be wrong about his timeline and methods, but his core observation about the tensions between hereditary authority and democratic values deserves serious consideration. The conversation continued late into the night as father and son wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. By dawn, they had reached a tentative conclusion about their path forward, one that would require careful implementation and might fundamentally alter the nature of royal authority itself. The decision would test every assumption they had held about duty, family loyalty, and the future of the crown, but it might also offer the only viable path through the crisis that had engulfed their family and threatened their kingdom's stability. The pale light of dawn filtered through the tall windows of Astoria Palace as Prince Marcus Montclair made his final preparations for what he believed would be the most important day of his life. In his private chambers, he reviewed the constitutional reform documents one last time, ensuring every argument was precisely articulated and every proposed change was clearly justified. Today, he would present his vision for democratic transformation to the editorial board of the Constitutional Review, knowing that publication would make his position irreversible and permanently alter his relationship with his family. Marcus had spent sleepless hours weighing the consequences of his planned revelation. He understood that going public would likely result in his removal from the line of succession, possible exile from the royal family, and the end of the privileged life he had known since birth. Yet he also believed that remaining silent would make him complicit in perpetuating a system he viewed as fundamentally unjust and increasingly unsustainable in the modern world. The secure telephone in his study rang precisely at 8 o'clock, displaying the encrypted number he had been expecting. Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist who had become his primary contact with the media, was calling to confirm their meeting arrangements and discuss the publication strategy they had developed over several weeks of careful planning. "Good morning, Your Highness," Sarah's voice carried the professional tone she used for all their communications, understanding that their conversations might be monitored despite the encryption protocols they employed. "I wanted to confirm our 2 o'clock meeting and review the materials you'll be presenting." "Everything is prepared," Marcus replied, glancing at the leather portfolio containing his reform proposals. "I have complete constitutional frameworks, transition timelines, and detailed analyses of how similar reforms have been implemented in other democratic monarchies." "Excellent. The editorial board is eager to review your proposals, and we've prepared comprehensive questions about implementation strategies and potential obstacles." Sarah paused briefly before continuing. "I should mention that we've received inquiries from other media outlets about your recent activities. Word is spreading that something significant is developing within the royal family." The news that other journalists were investigating the situation added urgency to Marcus's plans. If competing media organizations published speculation or partial information about his activities, it could complicate his carefully planned revelation and potentially distort his message. He needed to control the narrative by presenting his complete vision before others could characterize his actions as mere family rebellion or personal ambition. "Then, today's meeting becomes even more critical," Marcus said. "I need to ensure that my proposals are understood in their complete context rather than being reduced to sensational headlines about royal discord." "Agreed. We're prepared to publish a comprehensive analysis that treats your proposals with the seriousness they deserve, regardless of their controversial nature." Sarah's commitment to thorough journalism had been one of the factors that convinced Marcus to work with her rather than seeking outlets that might sensationalize his story for maximum impact. After ending the call, Marcus spent additional time reviewing intelligence he had gathered about the palace's surveillance operations. His counter-surveillance efforts had revealed the extent of his family's monitoring activities, providing him with detailed information about their security procedures and intelligence-gathering capabilities. This knowledge would be crucial if the palace attempted to prevent his meeting with the editorial board or interfere with the publication of his proposals. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Alexander was implementing the strategy he and King Charles had developed during their late-night deliberations. Rather than attempting to prevent Marcus's meeting through direct intervention, they had decided on a more subtle approach that might achieve their objectives while avoiding the public confrontation that heavy-handed tactics would certainly generate. Alexander's plan centered on presenting Marcus with a compelling alternative that might satisfy his reform aspirations while preserving essential royal functions. Working with their most trusted advisors, they had developed a constitutional modification proposal that incorporated democratic elements within the existing monarchical framework, a compromise that might address Marcus's concerns without requiring the complete dismantling of royal authority. "The key is timing," Alexander explained to Commander Blackwood as they reviewed their strategy. "We need to present our alternative proposal before Marcus commits publicly to his more radical position. Once his proposals are published, his credibility will depend on maintaining his original position rather than accepting compromises." The alternative proposal involved establishing a constitutional convention that would review royal powers and recommend democratic reforms within carefully defined parameters. It offered Marcus the opportunity to participate in genuine constitutional change while maintaining the basic structure of monarchical government. The proposal was designed to be attractive enough to give Marcus pause without surrendering so much royal authority that it would effectively accomplish his original objectives. Commander Blackwood coordinated the security aspects of their plan, ensuring that Marcus could be approached privately before his scheduled meeting without triggering the confrontation that direct interference might cause. The delicate operation required precise timing and careful attention to Marcus's likely reactions to their overture. At 11 o'clock, as Marcus prepared to leave the palace for his meeting with the Constitutional Review editorial board, he found Alexander waiting in the private corridor that connected their respective residential quarters. The brothers had rarely spoken privately since their confrontation in King Charles's study, and the sight of Alexander clearly intending to initiate conversation put Marcus immediately on guard. "Marcus," Alexander began, his tone more conciliatory than their recent interactions might have suggested. "I'd like to discuss something with you before you leave today. If this is another attempt to dissuade me from my planned activities, you're wasting both our time," Marcus replied, his suspicion evident in his posture and expression. "Actually, I want to present you with an alternative that might achieve your reform objectives without requiring the complete transformation you're proposing." Alexander gestured toward a nearby sitting room where they could speak privately. "5 minutes of your time, and, if you're not interested, I won't interfere with your plans." The offer surprised Marcus, who had expected continued opposition rather than potential cooperation from his brother. His curiosity about Alexander's alternative proposal outweighed his suspicion, leading him to agree to the brief conversation that might provide insight into the palace's evolving strategy. In the sitting room, Alexander presented the Constitutional Convention proposal with careful attention to the democratic elements that would appeal to Marcus's reform sensibilities. The plan offered genuine participation in constitutional change while maintaining structures that could preserve royal functions within a more democratic framework. "This isn't a delay tactic or an attempt to co-opt your position," Alexander assured his brother. "It's a recognition that your concerns about democratic legitimacy deserve serious consideration, combined with our belief that evolution might be preferable to revolution." Marcus studied the proposal documents carefully, recognizing the sophisticated political thinking that had produced them. The Constitutional Convention idea was genuinely appealing, offering a forum for democratic participation in royal reform while avoiding the chaos that might result from more dramatic changes. Yet he also understood that accepting this alternative would require him to abandon the comprehensive transformation he believed was necessary. "This is a significant step," Marcus acknowledged, "but it doesn't address the fundamental issue of hereditary power concentrating authority in individuals who haven't earned their positions through democratic selection. It creates a mechanism for addressing that issue through democratic processes rather than unilateral family decisions," Alexander replied. "The convention could recommend changes to succession laws, royal powers, or even the basic structure of monarchical government based on citizen input and democratic deliberation." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with both brothers presenting arguments for their respective approaches to constitutional reform. Marcus found himself genuinely conflicted about whether to proceed with his original plan or accept Alexander's alternative proposal. The Constitutional Convention offered real possibilities for democratic change while avoiding the personal and political costs of his more confrontational approach. As the time for his meeting with the editorial board approached, Marcus faced a decision that would determine not only his own future but the trajectory of democratic reform in their country. The choice between revolution and evolution, between dramatic transformation and gradual change, would shape how their society addressed the tensions between traditional authority and democratic values. "I need time to consider this proposal thoroughly," Marcus finally said, recognizing that his decision would have implications extending far beyond their family dynamics. "The editorial board meeting?" Alexander asked, understanding that Marcus would need to make an immediate decision about whether to proceed with his planned revelation. "I'm going to request a postponement while I evaluate your alternative," Marcus decided. "If we're going to pursue constitutional reform, it should be done in a way that maximizes the chances of success rather than simply expressing ideological purity." The decision represented a significant victory for Alexander's strategy, providing additional time to develop their constitutional convention proposal and potentially finding a path forward that could satisfy both brothers' concerns about their country's future. The crisis was far from resolved, but they had found a way to step back from the immediate confrontation that had threatened to tear their family apart and damage the monarchy's reputation permanently. Yet both brothers understood that this was merely a reprieve rather than a final resolution. The fundamental questions about democratic legitimacy and royal authority remained unresolved, and their ability to find lasting solutions would determine whether their family could navigate the transition to a more democratic future while preserving the positive aspects of their constitutional heritage. 3 weeks after Prince Marcus's decision to postpone his media revelation, Astoria Palace had become the center of unprecedented constitutional deliberations. The private library where King Charles, Prince Alexander, and Prince Marcus now met daily had been transformed into a constitutional workshop, its ancient oak tables covered with legal documents, democratic theory texts, and draft proposals for governmental reform. The atmosphere remained tense, but the sharp hostility of their initial confrontations had evolved into something resembling collaborative debate. Marcus sat across from his father and brother, reviewing the latest version of their Constitutional Convention proposal. The document had grown from Alexander's initial outline into a comprehensive framework for democratic participation in royal reform, incorporating elements that satisfied Marcus's democratic sensibilities while preserving functions that maintained monarchical stability. The evolution of their discussions had surprised all three men, demonstrating that compromise was possible even across seemingly irreconcilable philosophical differences. "The citizen participation mechanisms are more robust than I initially expected," Marcus acknowledged, studying sections that outlined how ordinary citizens would contribute to constitutional deliberations. Direct democratic input through regional assemblies, expert testimony from constitutional scholars, and public hearings in major population centers, this creates genuine opportunities for democratic influence rather than mere consultation. King Charles nodded approvingly, his satisfaction evident despite the personal cost of accepting limitations on royal authority. "The key insight has been recognizing that democratic legitimacy can strengthen rather than weaken effective governance, provided the institutional frameworks are carefully designed." The 3 weeks of intensive discussions had produced unexpected revelations about each man's fundamental beliefs and priorities. Alexander had discovered that his commitment to preserving royal functions stemmed more from concern for political stability than from attachment to absolute authority. King Charles had found that his dedication to constitutional continuity could accommodate democratic reforms that enhanced rather than undermined governmental effectiveness. Marcus had learned that his democratic ideals could be pursued through evolutionary change rather than revolutionary transformation. Commander Blackwood entered the library carrying the day's intelligence briefings, his expression significantly more relaxed than during the crisis's early stages. The surveillance operations had been scaled back as the family's internal negotiations replaced security concerns with collaborative planning. The commander's role had evolved from threat assessment to logistical support for their constitutional reform project. "The public opinion research is complete, Your Majesty," Commander Blackwood reported, placing a comprehensive analysis on the table. "The results suggest significant citizen support for constitutional modernization, particularly among younger demographics, but also strong preference for gradual change rather than dramatic transformation. The polling data validated their approach to gradual reform while confirming Marcus's assessment that public sentiment favored democratic evolution. Citizens wanted more participation in governance decisions while maintaining the stability and continuity that the monarchy traditionally provided. The Constitutional Convention proposal aligned well with these public preferences, offering democratic engagement within familiar institutional frameworks. Alexander reviewed the detailed polling results, noting patterns that supported their developing strategy. 73% support for increased citizen participation in constitutional review, but only 38% favor elimination of the monarchy entirely. This suggests that most people share Marcus's desire for democratic reform without accepting his original conclusions about the incompatibility of royal and democratic institutions. Which reinforces our decision to pursue constitutional evolution rather than revolution, King Charles observed. We can achieve democratic legitimacy while preserving the governmental stability that citizens value in monarchical systems. Lady Stirling arrived with updates on the logistical planning for their proposed constitutional convention. Over the past week, she had worked with legal experts and democratic institutions specialists to develop detailed procedures for citizen participation, expert testimony, and deliberative processes that would ensure the convention's legitimacy and effectiveness. The timeline for implementation has been finalized, Lady Stirling reported, consulting her comprehensive planning documents. 6 months for organizational preparation, including citizen selection procedures and expert recruitment. 12 months for deliberative processes, including regional assemblies, expert panels, and public hearings. 6 months for final recommendations and implementation planning. The 18-month timeline reflected their commitment to thorough democratic participation while maintaining momentum for constitutional change. Marcus had initially advocated for faster implementation, but had accepted arguments that rushing such fundamental changes could undermine their legitimacy and effectiveness. What about international precedents and expert consultation? Marcus asked, maintaining his focus on ensuring the convention's intellectual rigor and democratic authenticity. We've established relationships with constitutional experts from 6 countries that have successfully modernized their monarchical systems, Lady Stirling replied. They'll provide comparative analysis and practical guidance based on their experiences with similar reform processes. The international consultation would help them avoid pitfalls that had complicated constitutional changes in other countries while adapting successful strategies to their specific national context. Marcus had insisted on this element, arguing that their reforms should benefit from the best available expertise rather than relying solely on domestic perspectives. Sir Robert Crawford joined them with final legal analyses of their constitutional convention proposal. His initial skepticism about the project had evolved into cautious optimism as the framework developed into something more sophisticated than he had anticipated. The legal foundations for their reform process were solid, providing protection against constitutional challenges while ensuring the convention's recommendations would have legitimate authority. The legal framework is comprehensive and defensible, Sir Robert reported. The convention will operate under clear constitutional authority, its recommendations will be subject to established legislative procedures, and the entire process includes appropriate safeguards against manipulation or procedural irregularities. What about the succession question? King Charles asked, addressing one of the most sensitive aspects of their reform proposals. The convention will have authority to recommend changes to succession laws, including modifications that incorporate democratic elements while maintaining hereditary continuity, Sir Robert explained. This could include requirements for heir confirmation through democratic processes, expanded roles for elected officials in succession decisions, or other innovations that balance democratic legitimacy with monarchical stability. The succession issue had been one of their most difficult discussions, requiring them to balance Marcus's democratic principles with practical concerns about governmental continuity. Their compromise allowed democratic input into succession processes without completely eliminating hereditary elements that provided stability across political transitions. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the library windows, the 3 men found themselves reviewing a transformation that none of them could have imagined when their crisis began. What had started as a family conflict threatening to destroy the monarchy had evolved into a collaborative effort to strengthen democratic governance while preserving beneficial aspects of their constitutional heritage. "I want to say something to both of you," King Charles began, his formal tone giving way to genuine emotion. "These weeks have been among the most challenging of my reign, but they've also been among the most meaningful. We've discovered that our differences in philosophy don't have to become differences in family loyalty or shared commitment to our country's welfare." Alexander nodded, understanding his father's sentiment. "The crisis forced us to examine assumptions we'd never questioned and consider possibilities we'd never imagined. The result is stronger than what any of us could have achieved individually." Marcus looked at his brother and father, men with whom he had been prepared to break permanently just weeks earlier. "I've learned that democratic ideals can be pursued within family relationships rather than despite them, and that evolution can be more powerful than revolution when it's based on genuine consensus rather than imposed through conflict." The constitutional convention they had designed would begin implementation within 2 months, launching a democratic process that could fundamentally reshape their country's governance while maintaining stability and continuity. Citizens would participate directly in constitutional deliberations for the first time in their nation's history, while the monarchy would demonstrate its ability to evolve in response to democratic aspirations. Commander Blackwood interrupted their reflections with a final piece of intelligence that completed their story's transformation. "Your Majesty, the media speculation about royal family conflicts has largely dissipated, replaced by anticipation about the upcoming Constitutional Convention announcement. The narrative has shifted from family discord to democratic innovation." The change in public perception reflected their success in transforming a potential crisis into an opportunity for constructive change. Rather than damaging the monarchy's reputation, their internal conflicts had generated a reform process that strengthened democratic legitimacy while preserving governmental stability. As evening approached, the three men prepared for the public announcement that would reveal their constitutional convention proposal to the nation. The speech would mark the end of their private crisis and the beginning of a public process that could reshape their country's democratic future. King Charles would address the nation that evening, with both sons standing beside him to demonstrate their united commitment to constitutional reform through democratic participation. The address would acknowledge the tensions between hereditary authority and democratic values while presenting their constitutional convention as a solution that honored both principles. Citizens would be invited to participate directly in governance reform, while the monarchy would demonstrate its ability to evolve in response to democratic aspirations. Standing together in the library where their collaboration had developed, the three men understood that they had achieved something remarkable. They had transformed a family crisis into a national opportunity, converted ideological conflict into collaborative reform, and demonstrated that democratic evolution could strengthen rather than weaken effective governance. The Constitutional Convention would test their proposals against public scrutiny and citizen participation, but they faced the challenge with confidence born from their successful navigation of seemingly impossible differences. Their story would continue through the democratic processes they had designed, but the personal and political transformation they had achieved provided a foundation for whatever challenges lay ahead. The monarchy had demonstrated its capacity for democratic evolution, while democratic ideals had found expression through constructive rather than destructive change. The balance they had achieved between tradition and innovation, between family loyalty and political principle, offered a model for addressing similar challenges in other times and places where hereditary institutions confronted democratic aspirations. This story is a complete work of fiction. All characters, events, institutions, and locations are products of the author's imagination and do not represent any real persons, organizations, or historical events.